Today's topic is the memories of an Australian who has been visiting India for at least 50 years, I think now. And he will tell us the changes that he saw, what happened to him, and perhaps implicitly bring out the changes in the economy. Hello, everyone. It's good to be back with you once again. Today, I have with me Dr. Robert Smith. He has a Ph.D. in political science, and then he was a government official. More importantly, he loves India, speaks Hindi, and has been to India many times. And he's going to tell us his memories. I believe they are in three parts, his talk. So Bob, will you, using the Australian method of addressing each other by the first name? Otherwise, I should be calling him Smith G. But I'll just call him. If I was speaking to him as an Indian, I would say Smith G. And maybe some people call him Bob G, but I'll just call him Bob. So Bob, please go ahead with the first part.
Well, thank you, Subodh. This is an interesting thing to do. I'm well known in my family for my eccentricity in studying India and visiting India for a long time. And this started because of Margaret, who has now been my wife for more than 50 years, because in 1963, she went to India and she and her people had such a good time that I went the following year. However, my initial visit to India did not leave me with an appreciation of why it was so interesting and useful to keep studying the country. There were elements of confrontation, elements of confusion, elements of simply not understanding because there was too wide a gap between the experience in India and my experience in rural South Australia and in the provincial city of Adelaide, where I studied. However, the story is that confrontation turned to fascination with time and a drive to understand. And two things ran through my time regularly and irregularly visiting India. First of all was to try to see beyond the surface of an older civilization which predated much of the European education that we had in Australia and had its own independent validity and its own influence upon many parts of the world, as well as interaction with many parts of the world. And that interaction, that two-way interaction, was often obscured, not only in India, but also especially in the European-derived education that we had. The other thing that happened was I spent a good deal of time while I was in India thinking about our own culture, institutions, and way of thinking in Australia. So the initial confrontation and confusion turned into a series of questions. So that was what happened with my first visit in 1964-65. As I was doing some postgraduate study, I realised that my topic was not exhausting my complete interest. It was Australian wheat farmers and wheat marketing and wheat grower politics and economics and all the rest of it. And I found that I was turning for relaxation to books by Myron Weiner and others about Indian state politics. And from there,
Bob, let me just interrupt here for a minute because many people won't know the name. Myron Weiner was an American professor who wrote extensively about India's politics, very famous man, and with a lot of good books and a lot of understanding. So that's Myron Weiner, just in case some people may not know. So sorry to interrupt, Bob, but please go ahead.
No, well, look, thank you for that explanation, because this was in the late 1960s when Professor Wiener was producing very important work which was easily accessible in Australia and which was providing me with a way of getting back into Indian affairs on Indian terms. So when I got a teaching job at La Trobe University in Melbourne in 1969, I was asked what else from Australian politics would I want to teach, and I said, well, one of the professors I knew had a deep interest in India. I said I wouldn't mind having a go at deepening my interest in India, and after a good deal of discussion, they agreed. And so I decided to use my first and only, as it turns out, study leave to go to India for 6 months in 1972. And this is where two things happened. First of all, I had known of the work of Professor Bruce Graham of the University of Sussex, who was a Ph.D. Graduate from ANU, Australian National University, where I'd done my graduate study. And I wrote to Professor Graham saying, look, I'd like to follow your path in moving from Australia into India as a field of interest. What would you recommend? Where would you recommend I go? And he wrote back very graciously and helpfully saying, I'd recommend the University of Rajasthan in Jaipur. That's a good place to go. And I'd recommend that you write to Mr. P.C. Mathur, who has been to Sussex and who impressed us all here. And we think that he would be an excellent contact. So I wrote to P.C. Mathur, and that led to a very long personal association as well as an institutional association, which only ended with Professor P.C. Mathur's unfortunate death a few years ago. And I still feel his loss, because whenever I go to Jaipur, I feel ready for yet another long PC series of lectures on what is happening in India, what should be happening in the world. So he became, on the recommendation of Professor Graham, my teacher in India.
Well,
so we stayed in.
Bob, I have to add at this point that I heard more of those lectures than you, because he was my oldest brother.
That's right. And so what we did was, when we found we got to the University of Rajasthan, P.C. Mathur had arranged for us to stay at the university guest house, and therein began a series of lectures, not only by P.C. but by other people, including Subodh, because each evening P.C. would come with members of his family to the guest house when it was cool enough to walk the streets of Jaipur, and we would sit and drink Coca-Cola and talk on the hot nights before we had dinner. And so these informal tutorials were formative for our family in many respects. Margaret and I remember these very strongly, and people in India, in Jaipur, still remember our then 2.5-year-old daughter, Megan, who's now 53, and she, unfortunately, was the only one of us who learned usable Hindi, and is the only one of us who has no memories whatsoever, right, of the time. And so what this led to, from my point of view, was that I went back to La Trobe University with a good deal of improved understanding, with a lot of books for the library, and was able to revamp the course in what for me was at least a satisfactory way. Whether the students found it so is another matter. And so, being in India, meeting and reading the work of Indian scholars in India and getting an understanding of how to move around the country, how to learn a little bit of Hindi, how to accept and move with the way in which Indian families and Indian professionals worked was something that I began to get a little bit of understanding about at that stage.
Bob,
so
what I remember
back,
most is the bicycle trip to Sanganer. Sanganer,
yeah,
it was, we had only bicycles at that time, right? All of us went on
yes,
bicycles, and Sanganer was an exotic village at that time where there were handicrafts and such things. And today, of course, it's part of the city of Jaipur. It has expanded so much. But in those days, it was an adventure to go there. And we didn't go by car, we went by bicycle. That's what I remember.
well, look, indeed, and the bicycles, the dusty roads, the auto rickshaws, the riding somewhere, getting off, going to a shop, walking around. This was all part of the experience of learning to not merge into Indian society, but participate in Indian society, not simply as a gawking tourist, as someone who is trying to actually understand it from the point of view of the people we were meeting. So at this stage, I was on the way to coming up with a research proposal which I could go back to work on. And then there was a swerve because a job came up at the Australian National University and I applied for it, got it, and this was studying Australian institutions and processes of policy making. And as a condition of this job, my old supervisor and head of department said, "And please stop your stuff on India. Get on with the research project."
How wrong he was. How wrong he was.
So I did.
So
I did. And the Indian interest went subterranean. And from there, I got so interested in the interaction of ministers and public servants that I went into the South Australian Public Service, I thought for a short period, in order to understand what we were interviewing public servants about. Well, that turned into a nearly 20-year career in the public service. However, I kept with the interest in India, as did Margaret, and we went on further private visits to India. And this was in 1976 when C Mathur was in Shimla and newly married. I went there and met PC and Shashi there. And then again in 1988, we managed to get to Calcutta, Delhi and Rajasthan. And then in 1995, 2001, Margaret and I visited the South and Mumbai a couple of times. So that was our original introduction to India and how India introduced itself to a couple of foreigners from Australia.
Okay, that's very good. I mean, I'm so glad you remember so many things and you have told us about them. I think it's very valuable for some of the younger people who will watch YouTube and, they will hear an authentic experience that somebody who came from, as you said, a different background altogether, but was able to actually enjoy the diversity and differences in India. So I'm glad that you have mentioned this. I think you have now to move on to your second part of the talk, right?
That's right. And as I mentioned, I had nearly 20 years in the public service, and in that time, I served in the South Australian Public Service, the Victorian Public Service, and the Queensland Public Service. And in Australia, the state public services are quite separate from each other and from the federal public service, the Commonwealth Public Service. So each time I joined a public service, I was a lateral recruit, basically went where there were interesting jobs, and there were people saying to me, you might apply for a job with us. So that was a damn good run, but in 1996 it came to an end. I was kicked out of the Queensland Public Service after a change of government, which is the usual way things happen in this country now. And so I intended to stay in Brisbane. That didn't happen either. And we returned to Melbourne, and I returned to university teaching for quite a few years as a casual and temporary teacher. And the interest in this was that this time I was asked to teach graduate students in public sector management, and a lot of the most interesting students were Asian. They were people in Australia from Asian civil services, mainly Indonesia and Bangladesh, and they were terribly interested in civil service procedures and had been sent by their governments quite often on Australian scholarships to become better senior officers. And so these were smart, interactive people who we were able to help by basically running them through public policy, public management literature, but inviting them to write and to talk about the issues they were facing in their countries. So the plus for us was that we learned a lot about Indonesia and Bangladesh, as well as meeting some very nice people. At the same time, a number of Australian universities were getting into closer contact with Asian universities, and there became an opportunity to join an annual public management conference, which was run in a variety of countries, including India. And this provided opportunities to meet people, including from India, the Philippines, China, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Singapore, Malaysia, the whole thing. And for someone like me who'd always been interested in contacts with Asia because of an early experience in boarding school, where a large number of our fellow students were from the then British colony of Malaya. Yeah. And so we had, from an early age, an interest in other cultures. So I gave papers, met people, received invitations to go to places. And during this time, I sharpened my academic focus onto governance, public policy, accountability, capability, and turned my interest in how ministers and public servants in Australia work with people to produce public value, to doing this in an Asian context where the political party system, the constitutional systems, the cultural systems, the religious systems were very different. And this was really a bit of a drug. Teaching about this was not a necessity for earning a living. It was a necessity because one got on this drug of teaching and learning, and it was impossible to get off it.
True.
And so that's how I managed to turn a lay interest into India into something that could be considered a more serious course of study.
I think your last topic is Hindi and research papers. So let's hear about that, Panditji.
That's right. So associated with this, when I got to the end of my teaching career 2005, I knew that La Trobe University had a Hindi lecturer, Dr. Peter Friedlander, and I promptly in 2006 enrolled in Hindi 1 at La Trobe University and did as many of things as were available. The result was great satisfaction for me, but not in terms of being literate in or fluent in Hindi. My spoken Hindi is not good at all. My written Hindi is such that if I'm forced to write 3 pages in Hindi, I can. It'll take me a little while, but the bonus is that if I see an article in an Indian newspaper or journal like The Print, which is in Hindi, if I spend a day or two on it, I can read the thing.
Wow.
And this leads to all sorts of nuances that you don't get through English, and also enable an appreciation of why in India speaking and learning and working in the dominant language in your part of the country is so important to you. And so in Hindi-speaking states in the north, it is understandable that speaking and learning, working in Hindi is natural, as it is for people in Tamil Nadu to want to do the same in Tamil. And this is, of course, a quite interesting understanding and quite confronting in arguing in places like Australia, where people still say, oh, I've been to India 6 times and I have no problems. Every person I meet speaks perfect English.
That's not true.
My comment about that is, okay, let's go to a regional city where there are a few airlines flying, and we get off the plane in that regional city, and your job is to get the taxi into the city. How do you think you'd go?
Yeah.
Because the first time I went to Varanasi, it was difficult to find the prepaid taxi counter. I found myself outside. It was the middle of summer, and there was a policeman there, so I asked him in Hindi where the prepaid taxi counter was. It was in the middle of the car park, and I slaved my way over there, and then got myself into Varanasi. So learning Hindi provided me with a valuable lesson. When people say we want to speak Hindi, we need to speak Hindi, we don't really need or want to speak English. There is a very good reason for this. Now, there's also a very good reason for them understanding English and other European languages, understanding Chinese, understanding Bahasa Indonesian, all the rest of it. But if you're going to work in the world, you need to be able to work in your own language and then have some choice about the other languages in which you work. So that was what I did there. And I realized that although I was getting through the courses that Peter was running at La Trobe, I wanted to have a go at operating in a Hindi-speaking environment. So I sent an email to Professor Mathur and said, PC, is there somewhere in Jaipur that I could come and have private lessons in Hindi? And he cast around and consulted his extensive network, including the extensive Mathur family, and came up with no one in Jaipur. But he said, look, there's this lady I've not met called Professor Asha Viswas in Varanasi, and she says you can write to her. So thanks to PC, I wrote to Asha, and she said, come in May. And I think that was a test to see if I'd turn up when it was hot. And I did, and that meant that I had regular visits between 2008 2006 and 2017, mostly for a month at a time. And Usher very kindly and pro bono provided me with exercises in speaking and written Hindi on a daily basis. And I said to Usher, I need one day off. She said, why do you need a day off? You can just work all day. I said, this, for me, this is hard work. So it was extremely pleasant, very useful, and through the contact not only with the Mathur family but with Dr. Viswas herself, I learned a certain amount about Indian family life from the inside by being someone who was regularly there and was, for the time of the visit, part of the furniture. And so that was extremely important for me, because it indicated that for a country like India, not only time spent, it was mode of interaction with people and trying to get into situations where you had to understand what it was like to be an Indian. And of course, there was no way I could be an Indian. I didn't look like an Indian. I didn't speak like an Indian. However, the strange thing was that on a couple of occasions, I was accosted by people in Delhi and other places, and they said, hang on, we know you. Began speaking to me in Hindi. I said, no, look, I'm sorry, I'm not Indian. You're not Indian, they said. I said, no, definitely not. One of these was in Connaught Place, and one of these was in a bus station in between Delhi and Jaipur, where I'd walked out of the dining room, and there was a chowkidar there, and so he was smiling at everyone, and I jokingly said something in broken Hindi, and got in the bus, and then this bloke turned up and came along and looked at me very deeply, very closely in the face, got his face up close to mine and said, are you Indian? I said, no, mate, I'm not. And he was quite surprised, because he thought for some strange reason I was an Indian. So okay. I took that as an indication that although the attempt was imperfect, it was worth making to try to blend in as far as I could.
Okay.
So that was that was another extension of the Jaipur connection, which led from Bruce Graham to C Mathur, the Mathur family, and on to Varanasi. And our most recent visit has been in 2023 with Barrister Rob Heath, who's also our son-in-law.
Okay.
So to conclude this section, this meant that associated with the time I spent going to Varanasi and other places in India between 2006 and 2023, I began writing papers mainly on the basis of what I read and what I heard when I was there. And so I looked at things such as the meanings of governance, the difference in usage between India and elsewhere. There's quite a specific usage of governance in India associated with the term shasan, with strong leadership, and this is quite different from the way in which governance is used in Europe, the US, and Australia. And I wrote an article on that, which was picked up recently by someone at General University, and that was quite interesting. I extended that into governance and capability because quite a lot of recent stuff, especially from the Centre for Policy Research in Delhi, is about state capacity, and I've termed this capability. And it seems to me to be quite important for not only facilitating economic growth, which is important, but also facilitating the opportunities of people in all walks of life in India to participate in the benefits of economic growth, because, well, markets can do wonderful things and private enterprise can do wonderful things. There are some public goods which are, in many respects, most efficiently and effectively presented by government. And so if you've got governments that are capable, you have better opportunities, you have better life chances. So because India is a federation, although a very different one from Australia, I've written several papers on federalism, intergovernmental relations, and the international implications of having a federal system and having thus several different possible centres of influence. And this is particularly difficult for India because of the strong central emphasis upon the union government following the tragedies of partition and the subsequent awful experiences between
So, Bob, we will come back to you with another Vidped in which we will discuss these issues. Okay, so this one's about your personal experiences and so on. But both you and I are both academics, and we would love to discuss these issues. Let's set another date, and we will discuss India as you see it, and comparisons between India and Australia, which are very important. And we will discuss your understanding of Bangladesh, Indonesia, India, all of it in a somewhat more academic way in another recording. I think we need to keep the two separate. You've done a wonderful job in telling us the personal side, and I'm sure you'll do a wonderful job in the academic side. And let's just do it on another episode. What do you say?
I think that's I think that's fair enough. I was just going through the sorts of things that I've got into, and if you'd like to talk about that on another occasion, then I'll be happy to do so.
Yeah, I think we need to. This is just more of personal interaction and sets the stage. And I would love to hear your thoughts on what you call Shashan, governance, all these things. I think it's very important, and we should have enough time in another episode to go through it fully. Okay, so let's end this episode here. And thank you so much, as I called you Panditji. Panditji, thank you so much for coming and telling us all about partly my own family, but partly your view of India as a foreigner. And we will say bye at this time, and we'll come back to you shortly at a convenient date and come back and discuss the other issues that you have brought up. So I will say thank you and bye-bye to the viewers. Bye-bye.